Please forgive me if I start by repeating a story which I used in the presentation on Thursday night, but it's a useful starting point, and I think it's rather delightful too. In 1914, the trenches were close together. The British could see the Germans and vice versa. The Germans put up a banner saying, "Gott mit uns," God is with us. The British retaliated with their typical sense of humour by putting up their banner which said, "We got mittens too." They needed mittens, of course, because you couldn't fire a gun wearing gloves, but got mittens and we got mittens was much the same. But when they got together at the Christmas truce and started talking to each other, they found that the Germans believed that God really was with them, that they were fighting for freedom and peace, just as the British believed. And they couldn't understand that. And it never is easy to come to terms with. Where is God in a time of war? Does God take sides? It was amazing, really, having two keen Christian countries at war with each other. How did that happen? War raises so many difficult questions and challenges to our Christian faith and to people who haven't even got a Christian faith. Because war is an evil atrocity. War is obscene. War shouldn't be allowed, but how do you prevent it? How can you stop it happening? When we remember this anniversary of the First World War, we have to look for the lessons we can learn for our future. Can some people say, we are fighting in the name of God? Because the pacifists reply, not in his name, not in my name. Many people cannot possibly see war as something which they can take part in. But if your country is being attacked, or if an ally of your country is being attacked, should you go to war to protect those who are being invaded? Are the answers in the Bible? I'm sure it's the best place to look. The trouble is that we live in an imperfect world. But we have to discover what the Bible teaches to us about the real world that we live in. In Isaiah, which we heard this morning, and also in Micah chapter 4, the prophet declares, in the days to come, nations will never again go to war, never prepare for battle again. Everyone will live in peace. The Lord Almighty has promised this. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. It comes twice. Two prophets were making the same prophecy. Then in the New Testament, Jesus said, greater love has no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. And Jesus also said, you have heard it said, love your friends, hate your enemies. But now I tell you, love your enemies. And that must have come very hard to the Jews, who believed if you had enemies, well, you clobbered them thoroughly. But this is the Christian ideal, coming from the prophets, coming to Jesus. It's an ideal. The teaching of Jesus is usually a counsel of perfection, and none of us is perfect. But we need to have an ideal, we need to have a goal. After all, the highest ideals and goals of perfection must come from God. The difficulty is, how can we possibly live up to them? And we can't. We can only do that, or try to do it, with God's help through the Spirit of God and his inspiration. We can never do it by ourselves. But we have to balance these two texts from the Old Testament against other teaching in the Bible. At a different time, the prophet Joel writes, proclaim this among the nations, prepare for war. Call your warriors. Gather all your soldiers for attack. Beat your ploughshares into swords and your pruning hooks into spears. Even the weak must fight. Different times, different tactics. And Jesus, as we heard in Mark chapter 13, said there will be wars and rumours of wars. Such things must happen. And in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, there's a time for so many different things under the sun, but there's a time for war and a time for peace. As a chaplain to the military, it wasn't always an easy role. I can remember a situation when I was on active service where our men were being attacked. We sent out, as it were, a rescue party, and I went with them. They said, "Padre, you haven't got a gun, you can't come. What are you coming for?" And I said, "I have to be there. There are men injured and killed. People need help, not just guns." But then another problem as a chaplain is that it seemed that in some ways you needed to be like an umpire or a referee, that war was like a game that needed to be played according to the rules of the Geneva Convention. And that was an important thing, certainly for chaplains, to prevent the military getting out of hand and killing innocent people. But really, once you are in a state of war, as happened in 1914, it's like being in a runaway vehicle which is out of control. Once it starts, you can't stop it. The difficulty was we'd got treaties. We'd promised in the Treaty of London to come to help little neutral Belgium in time of need. They were being invaded by Germany, who were trying to do a flanking movement to get to Paris through the back door. And so we tried to tell the Germans that they must retreat or we would have to come to the defence of Belgium, and they didn't. And so we went. But our men went off very enthusiastically. The British Expeditionary Force, the contemptible little army, as the Kaiser was reputed to have called them, they felt it was a just cause, and they were hoping to set matters right by Christmas. But what a tragedy it was. A tragedy of good intentions. No one realised what a world war could be like, that it would snowball until all the world, it seemed, was involved. The difficulty now is that any military confrontation can easily escalate into global destruction. We have, as happened in 1914, weapons which we don't realise the power of. In yesterday's Times, there was a letter signed by a number of bishops and interchurch leaders calling for the nuclear deterrent to be renounced. And at the same time, in the same paper, I read that both the RAF and the French Air Force are now ready to strike at ISIS targets. Do we need deterrence? Is that the way to stop war? I think it worked for a long time in the Cold War. Certainly serving in Germany with the Royal Air Force and the rest of the forces of NATO, we were welcomed there. We were keeping the communists from flooding all over Europe. Deterrence can work, but weapons of war can get out of hand. Where is God in all this? I believe in his promise in the Bible, "I am with you always to the end of time." God sent his Son into the world to save the world, our imperfect, fallen world. We have the ideals of peace, and we strive to find peace through love and hope and faith, and all the qualities which God gives us which can help to bring about a new world. And yet the strange thing is that as civilizations build up and we think we're making progress, somehow or other the bad people get into power and they destroy it all. The world we live in is not heaven. It's not utopia. And I don't think God ever meant it to be. It's a world where we struggle with sin. But if we didn't have this kind of difference between good and evil, it wouldn't be a real world. And if God could come and, as it were, like a divine magician, stop wars, make everything better again, we would lose our free will. It wouldn't be the world that God intended it to be. But the wonderful thing, I think, in the First World War is that in all the horrors and obscene atrocities, Christ was there. God in Christ, on both sides, with everyone, making no difference between friends and enemies. And there were many great chaplains in the First World War who helped those who were suffering, injured, dying, to know that God was with them. Chaplains like Tubby Clayton of Toc H and Studder Kennedy, known as Woodbine Willie. It's amazing the way a cigarette made all the difference to the troops in the front at that time. Nowadays, we wouldn't think of giving people cigarettes in a time of war, perhaps, but if you're going to die, well, I suppose you might as well die with a cigarette. But that's by the way. The main thing is that there's no difference between the secular world and the religious world. Many people, I think, felt that the chaplain couldn't be there in a time of battle or exercise. He ought to be in church. He ought to be somewhere in his world. But in fact, there aren't two worlds. God is in our world, and it's both secular and sacred, and we shouldn't try to pretend that they are different. They're both one world. But there is a world to come which gives us hope for the future. I would like to end with some verses written by Studder Kennedy as a result of his experiences in the First World War. I look upon that body, writhing, pierced, and torn with nails, and see the battlefields of time, the mangled dead, the gaping wounds, the sweating dazed survivors struggling back, the widows, worn and haggard, still dry-eyed because their weight of sorrow will not lift and let them weep. I see all history pass by, and through it all still shines that face, the Christ face, like a star, which pierces drifting clouds and tells the truth. So through the clouds at Calvary there shines his face, and I believe that evil dies, and good lives on, loves on, and conquers all. All war must end in peace. These clouds are lies, they cannot last. The blue sky is the truth. My reasons for it, and I find them strong enough. And you want to argue? Well, I can't. It is a choice. I choose the Christ. And so will we, if we learn the lessons of the past, find in Christ the answer to all the wars to come, to all the conflicts, to all the tribulation, to all the problems of the world. They're all in his hands, and he's with us and all his people everywhere.